Hi, my name is Connor Riley, and on this episode of Connor in Coverage, we're going to be talking about Georgia winning ugly and the wind. Our first winner here tonight on Connor in Coverage is Georgia in SEC play. With the win over Kentucky, granted it was 16-6, the Bulldogs now move to 8-0 in SEC play for the second straight season. They become the third team in SEC history to accomplish such a feat, joining Florida in 1995 and 96, and Alabama in 2008 and 2009. Now, yes, Georgia was playing in a weaker SEC East, but one only needs to take a look around the rest of college football this week to see how hard it is to consistently be great week in and week out. And the fact that Georgia had already wrapped up the SEC East and still went on the road and took care of business, winning in a wire-to-wire fashion, shows just how different and unique this team is. As Kirby Smart told reporters after the game, this team might not be as dominant as last year's team was that also went 8-0 in the regular season, but there's a mental toughness to this team that I don't think last year's team had a chance to show. Consider that this Georgia team very much is aware of the fact that last year's season didn't end in an SEC championship and the fact that they still have that to play for. Even with having the SEC East wrapped up, it says something to Kirby Smart that his team went on the road, took on a tough physical Kentucky team, and came away with a victory.
To do. Last 40 years, there's only been two. And it's hard to win on the road in the SEC. You look across the country today, you see the environments people were playing in. You see it's different. You find out real quick who really wants to play football and who's just a football fan. And you have to be able to win in games like that, especially in November.
Smart there is referencing the fact that TCU needed a last-second field goal along with Michigan to stay unbeaten on Saturday. Ohio State also struggled in the afternoon as well there, and yet there was Georgia winning by double digits once again. And they took care of business, albeit not in the most convincing fashion, and beat a solid Kentucky team. This Georgia team is 11-0 for the second straight season, and it means quite a bit to Kirby Smart and this team that this program continues to rack up wins. If Georgia continues to take care of business, this senior class, led by the likes of Nolan Smith, Zion Logue, and others, has a chance to exit as the winningest in program history. And that's including the pandemic year where Georgia only played 10 games, with the Vanderbilt game getting canceled that season and Georgia not playing its full 13-game slate. So for this team to continue to rack up wins and do so in all conditions says quite a lot about where this Georgia program is in comparison to the rest of college football.
Hellified leadership. I mean, for the leaders on this team to stand up. And, I asked them before we left to come here in the team meeting, what makes you different than last year's team? And they said, our response to adversity. And I put 15, 16, 17 seniors at the front of the room and said, each one of you, tell me what this game means to you. And because you could say, what are they playing for? Well, playing for a chance to be the winningest team, one of the first teams to ever do the two undefeated, chance to dominate on the road, chance to win on a four-game stretch that I don't know that I've seen a four-game stretch quite like that one in our league. And they did it, like they owned it, and I'm proud of it.
Now, first loser is Georgia's offense in any conditions that aren't perfect. Obviously, the weather was a factor on Saturday. It was quite cold to someone who was there, and the wind was definitely a factor, as we'll hear Kirby Smart get into in a second here. But when you factor in the Tennessee game, where Georgia clearly downshifted its offense due to the weather conditions, it is a little concerning that Georgia is at least willing to let the weather dictate how this offense plays. Georgia was not at its best on Saturday on the offensive side of the ball, with Stetson Bennett only attempting 19 passes. It's a positive that Georgia had its running game going, with the notable exception in short yardage situations, but it still says quite a lot about this team that the offense can be dependent on just how good the weather conditions are in that specific game. Georgia obviously didn't play its best, and red zone finishing was a big reason why. But even if it were better conditions on Saturday, again, I think this is an offense that we know what it is at this point in time. And when the weather is less than perfect, it's not a great offense.
16 to 18 with gusts to 25. So, I mean, it was windy, but it's more about what you can and can't do in those conditions. And again, I think it affected Kentucky, affected us. I mean, wind's blowing one way, you got to think about when you're passing it, when you're throwing it. I mean, we do studies all the time about how it affects games when the wind gets up around 20 miles an hour. It's very different in the way you play the game. You got to be methodical, you got to be smart. You're not going to get many possessions.
Along those lines, it wasn't a real pretty game for Stetson, but is it conditions plus defense that's pretty good.
Again, where he's good is loose play, is getting out in space, being able to do things. There wasn't a lot of that tonight. There wasn't a lot of opportunity for that. Their defense is also pretty good. I mean, he's played against their defense a couple times. I know 2 years ago up here. They do a really good job because we get to watch them week in and week out. So they do a great job.
Georgia's offense scored only 1 touchdown in 5 trips inside the red zone. And quite frankly, the Bulldogs know they have to be better than that. It was a relapse to what we saw against Missouri and Kent State and even the first half against Auburn this year. While Georgia had fixed most of its red zone issues, that was a major problem on Saturday. And Georgia had a chance at the beginning of the fourth quarter to go up 23-0 and really completely ice the game away. Only they couldn't score on a third and short and a fourth and short situation right there on the goal line. I'm not going to question whether Kirby Smart was right or wrong for going for it there. I do think the right call was made in going it because in football, if you can't gain a yard when you need to, then you don't deserve to win. And while Georgia still found a way to win on Saturday, the offense faces some questions when games aren't played on their terms. Now, if there is a silver lining to this, Georgia has only one more game that will be played outdoors this season, and that's this coming Saturday at home against Georgia Tech. The SEC championship game against LSU will be played in Mercedes-Benz Stadium, and both playoff semifinals and the national championship game will all be played indoors as well. It seems like right now the only thing that can slow down this Georgia offense is itself, and maybe the weather plays a part in that. But based on what we saw on Saturday, this is a Georgia offense that needs to show what it was like in games against Oregon, South Carolina, into the first half against Tennessee, rather than Kentucky in the second half against Tennessee, where conditions were less than ideal. Our next winner is Shmuel Munden. Keely Ringo came down with an interception, and Javon Bullard had another big sack for this Georgia defense. And overall, outside of a 99-yard touchdown drive they gave up, the Georgia defense did its job on Saturday, making things difficult for Will Levis and running back Chris Rodriguez. But a player who deserves special praise here is Shmuel Munden, who led the team with 11 tackles. He almost single-handedly snuffed out Kentucky's first drive of the game, getting stops on 3rd and 1 and 4th and 1 to stall out a Kentucky drive that had gotten into Georgia territory. Munden has gotten overshined this year in part because of the excellent play by fellow sophomore linebacker Jamon Dumas-Johnson. Dumas-Johnson has become a key leader for this Georgia team, and in the absence of Nolan Smith, is the vocal leader for this defense. But don't let Johnson's loud play and style overlook the fact that what Munden is doing for this team. While he's not as naturally loud, he's an awesome player and a guy who has, I think, the potential to one day be a first-round draft pick. He has incredible athleticism and is getting better each and every week he plays. That's a scary thought for opposing offenses as this Georgia defense is rounding into shape each and every week. Consider that last year's defense ranked second in the country in run defense, giving up 78 yards per game. 6 starters from that defensive front a year ago were taken in the NFL draft, with 4 of them going in the first round. With all those new faces, though, Georgia is once again one of the best teams in stopping the other team's rushing games. As Kentucky on Saturday just had 89 yards rushing, and on the season, Georgia is giving up only 83 yards a game. That moves them down from second in the country to third. Stopping the run is paramount for Georgia, and they know that week in and week out. And the fact that Shmuel Munden is able to step in, and while he's not quite the next Quay Walker right now, the fact that he is trending in that direction so early in his Georgia career is a very positive sign for Glenn Schumann and this Georgia defense as they continue to develop players. Our next loser is Georgia's SEC East rivals. Now, obviously, South Carolina, we're not counting here after their huge win, but we'll get to the South Carolina-Tennessee game in a moment. Florida was riding a relative high, coming off wins that in impressive fashion against Texas A&M and South Carolina a week ago. And then they gave it all away with an embarrassing loss on the road to Vanderbilt. Prior to beating Kentucky last week, this was a Vanderbilt team that hadn't won an SEC game since 2019, and Florida was a 2-touchdown favorite on the road and couldn't beat a Vanderbilt team that is that the Florida Gators are far more talented than. Dan Mullen had an interesting quip on his post-game show on Saturday night going, when remarking the score of the Vanderbilt-Florida game, because for all that Mullen was not in his time at Florida, he never lost to Vanderbilt. And now you're looking at a Florida team that had the possibility of going 8-4 in Billy Napier's first season. Now looking at the realistic chance of going 6-6 as they take on a Florida State team next week that is ranked number 16 and playing very good football this time of year. Now, obviously, the wins and losses don't necessarily matter as Billy Napier is in charge of recruiting at a higher level than Mullen was in his time there. But Florida's only signing the 8th-ranked class right now, and Dan Mullen's first class at Florida was ranked 9th. So things might not be all that great for Billy Napier. And the one thing that Florida fans are hanging their hats on right now is that Kirby Smart also lost to Vanderbilt in his first year at Georgia. But if you want to compare Billy Napier to Kirby Smart, that might not necessarily be so wise. Obviously, this was a tough weekend for Florida, but as bad as it was for the Gators, things were even worse for Tennessee. We start with the news that Hendon Hooker is now out for the season after suffering a torn ACL. It occurred in the fourth quarter of a game. Tennessee was already losing 49-31. The final score in that game against South Carolina was 63-38. South Carolina last week, to underscore just how jarring this result was, scored a total of 6 points, with those points all coming on a fake punt. They scored 9 touchdowns against this Tennessee defense on Saturday. Spencer Rattler had 8 passing touchdowns coming into the game. He had 6. Tennessee defense was leaky and questionable all season, but while Tennessee was looking ahead and thinking about a possible rematch with Georgia, they very clearly overlooked a South Carolina team that is now 7-4 in their second year under Shane Beamer. And now, with Hendon Hooker out for the season, they're facing a must-win game against Vanderbilt this week, a suddenly hot team, to just make sure that they can make it into a New Year's Six Bowl. It's shades of 2016 all over again when Butch Jones had Tennessee poised for a breakthrough season, only for them to give away games late and end up playing in a less than stellar bowl. This has been a very special season for Tennessee, but a lot of it seemed to go down the toilet given where their aspirations were just a week ago. They were very well seen as the 4th best team in the country and a very real playoff contender. And now, without Hendon Hooker, we'll see what Joe Milton is able to give them at the quarterback position, but there's a very different tenure and tone on this Tennessee season, especially if they trip up again and let a loss against South Carolina turn into a loss against Vanderbilt this coming weekend. Our final winner here is Jack Podlesny. It wasn't all great for Georgia on Saturday, especially when it had the ball on offense. But the conditions, as we outlined earlier, played a part in that. And the fact that Georgia was able to have its kicker, Jack Podlesny, come through when called upon should not go unnoticed. Consider that Matt Ruffalo, no relation to Incredible Hulk Mark Ruffalo, missed a 38-yarder late in the game that would have made it a one-score game. The fact that Jack Podlesny went 3 for 3 on all of his field goals helped Georgia establish an early lead and make things more difficult for Kentucky as the game went on. Podlesny is now 20 of 22 on the season for Georgia, leading the SEC in made field goals and is 5th in the country in that same category. Hopefully we don't see as much of Podlesny on field goals in coming games and weeks, as that means Georgia is able to score touchdowns more effectively in the red zone. But it's a positive sign for this Georgia team that they know that they can count on their kicker to make makeable field goals, even in less than stellar conditions. He made big kicks last year in the national championship game, and Podlesny has once again proven to be a clutch kicker for Georgia on a week-in, week-out basis. I'm not sure where he ranks and stacks up next to Rodrigo Blankenship, but Podlesny has done a great job in his time at Georgia, being a very valuable kicker and asset to this Georgia program. And with that wraps up winners and losers here. We'll go straight into your questions. Obviously, I'm sure you guys have a lot coming out of that Kentucky game, why the team sort of looked the way it did, 16-6, not all that impressive. I would say conditions definitely played a big part in that. Injuries, we can talk about that a little bit as well. Tate Ratledge has a subluxation or a slight dislocation of a body part of his. Kirby Smart did not specify what. I do find it encouraging that he was able to travel with the team, and we might see him play. A.D. Mitchell did not travel with the team. Again, not all that surprised. I don't really know at what point we're going to see him. This is an injury that has obviously lingered for a long time. I think at this point, maybe it's following a trajectory like George Pickens, where perhaps you see him against Georgia Tech. They try and get him involved in the offense a little bit more in terms of getting him in a spot where he can possibly contribute to this team in the SEC championship game, in the potential college football playoff semifinal and national championship game. And it's worth pointing out here that Georgia's not the only team facing key injuries at this point in the season. Blake Corum picked up what looked to be an ankle injury of some sorts for Michigan on Saturday. Ohio State is looking like it might be potentially down to its third string running back, as Travion Henderson left yesterday's game in a boot, and Myron Williams, their other starting running back, was already injured. Jackson Smith and Jigba is obviously missing time with a hamstring injury, and it really just looks like a lost year for him. So when you play a very physical football game, or a game as physical as football is, you're bound to have injuries at this part of the year, and Georgia is no exception for that. I actually think, all things considered with where they are, obviously the Nolan Smith loss really stings, but given you haven't seen anything from A.D. Mitchell this year, you feel pretty good about where Georgia's injury situation is heading into this final week of the season. Obviously, Georgia Tech, big game. They come off a huge upset win over North Carolina. Brent Key continues to make a very strong case to be the full-time head coach there, replacing Jeff Collins. And while they're down to their third and fourth string quarterbacks there, this is a Georgia Tech team that is playing well. And I think Georgia is going to they will have Georgia's full attention this week, because they know you can even maybe look back to that 2019 Georgia Tech game where Georgia didn't necessarily have its eye on the ball that weekend, was looking ahead to LSU. DeAndre Swift picks up an injury. George Pickens gets ejected in the second half of that game. I think this Georgia team knows and understands, hey, before we get to LSU, let's make sure we take care of Georgia Tech. Get up big, get up early, and get out of there with an easy win and move on to LSU. The Bulldogs are obviously a huge favorite in that game. And I'm sure we'll see why does Georgia and Georgia Tech play every year? Well, they've played for 100 years, and there have been lulls in this rivalry before. I'd point out that Georgia Tech has a more recent win over Georgia than Tennessee does since I'm doing the math, since 2008. They have the same number of wins against Georgia that Auburn does. The reality is Georgia Tech, yes, they are playing an unfair game right now, but I think the disastrous coaching hire that was Jeff Collins really set that program back. And I think if they make the correct hire, which is, again, what a lot of people were saying after the end of the Paul Johnson era, where Paul Johnson had a decent amount of success, albeit with a triple option offense against Georgia, all things considered. If you're able to find the right coach there, I do in my heart believe that Georgia Tech can be a very robust football program that is able to compete, at least in the ACC level, maybe not in the national level that we've seen Georgia achieve in recent years, but being a place where they're able to compete and possibly win the ACC once every few years and be a consistent bowl team. I think there's enough resources there in Atlanta. I know people like to say, oh, you have the academic requirements. Look at Notre Dame in recent years. Look at Stanford in the early 2010s. The idea that you need academic, heavyweights to that there are academic barriers to being a great football team, I do not personally believe that. And I do think that Georgia Tech, if they are able to find the right coach with the talent that is located in Atlanta, that they're going to be able to possibly build a successful football program. They might already have that guy in Brent Key, a guy who knows the Alabama infrastructure, worked at Alabama with Kirby Smart, I think has done a really great job rallying these players, getting guys to buy in there. And I think he's done a really good job and deserves to be commended and looked at as a serious coaching candidate there. I know Jamie Chadwell is another name that has been mentioned often there. He's the head coach at Coastal Carolina. A hire in the similar vein, I think, to Paul Johnson with the option style offense, maybe not the straight triple option veer that Paul Johnson ran, but an option style offense that I think makes a lot of sense and gives Tech something unique that they had a lot of success with Paul Johnson. I also think given they hired Jay Batt as their athletic director for Georgia Tech, he was previously at Alabama. There are going to be a lot of people that make that connection from Bill O'Brien and him possibly getting that job. I do think Bill O'Brien is going to get a head coaching job, or he will be coaching elsewhere. I don't necessarily believe he will be back at Alabama the way things have gone there this season. And so we'll see if he takes the Tech job. I don't necessarily think he should. I think he can maybe aim a little bit higher given his resume, given how I know things ended with him in Houston, but he was a very successful NFL head coach. And I think he is a guy that could run the right program and obviously has expertise in that area, given the impossible task he stepped into at replacing Joe Paterno at Penn State and cleaning things up there at the end of the Jerry Sandusky area. So brief little overview on Georgia Tech there. Comments, questions, thoughts, what you have. Yeah, Mark Morris. Again, this is a Georgia Tech team. They play hard, and they might be a talented team, but they were down 17-0 in North Carolina on Saturday and fought back and won that game. And that was a North Carolina team with a lot to play for. And it says something about that. This is a Georgia team, unlike I think last year where that game was over when Georgia got off the bus. I think this is a Georgia Tech team that is going to make things difficult for Georgia, or at least try to. And this is a game where I don't want to say they were sleepwalking or looking past Kentucky, but this is a game where Georgia's going to need, especially with LSU that next week, get in, get up early, get out of there with an easy win, start prepping for the SEC championship. One thing we do know about this game, obviously Georgia doesn't get a home night game this year. This is not the game Kirby Smart would have wanted to be a night game. He wants to have that extra time to rest, to get prepared, and start focusing on the SEC championship game once you end this game. LSU, on the other hand, they go on the road to Texas A&M, so they're probably not getting home till 1 a.m. after midnight, given when that game will be played and the fact that it is going to be played in College Station. So Georgia gets a mini advantage with this game, A, being at home, and B, being an earlier kickoff there. And so if you're Georgia, I think you agree with. I think I agree with Mark. Not necessarily that we'll see a solid game, but that this is a better Tech team than what Georgia has seen, certainly last year when these two teams met and the Bulldogs won 45-0. Let's see. Comments, thoughts, questions. Yeah, Steve Rogers, Georgia tight ends last night. Season low involvement. Obviously, the conditions played a part in that, and I'm sure Kentucky made a very strong effort to take that area away from Georgia. Bowers, 2 catches, 10 yards. Donald Washington, 0 catches last night. That is a season low usage for the Georgia tight ends there. Again, I think conditions played a big part in that in games against LSU, certainly even against Georgia Tech next week. I think you're going to see a higher level of involvement of those Georgia tight ends. Let's see. Comments, thoughts. AI comments. Yeah. So to this point, major injuries on Saturday. No, nobody really got hurt. I know Broderick Jones briefly left the game, but he was able to come back in and be fine there. The injuries that they had were pre-existing. Tate Ratledge, we mentioned earlier, dealing with a sort of subluxation. It's a dislocated body part. Kirby Smart didn't specify which. Denylon Morissette had been dealing with a knee. That is why he did not make the trip to Kentucky there. But no major injuries occurred to Georgia during the course of the game. That's a big win there. Obviously, Javon Bullard played all last night. So I know there was some concern about him possibly and his availability for this week, but he was good to go there. Jeremy Hartman, this is a good point in regards to both Vanderbilt and Georgia Tech this week. I know those were two teams not many people thought very highly of to start the season. They're both entering a situation, obviously, as underdogs this week, but playing against teams. Vanderbilt needs one win to get to a bowl game and 6 wins. Georgia Tech needs a win on Saturday to get to a bowl game and 6 wins. And I think that can be a very big motivator going into a game like this for those teams. Let's see. Chris Haggard, Deion could get the Georgia Tech job. I do not think he wants it. I think he should aim higher. It'll be interesting to see what sort of job Deion Sanders ultimately ends up taking. But I don't think right now the Georgia Tech job is appealing enough to Deion for him to go take it. I have no doubt that he would do well there. I have no doubt that Georgia Tech would want to hire him. I just don't think that right now, with what Deion's trajectory possibly looks like, that he needs to take the Georgia Tech job. Let's see. Comments. Dennis Payne, this is a good point. Kenneth Milton looked really healthy yesterday. 6 carries, 31 yards. Did look like he had some of the burst back that he had prior to that injury. And so if you're able to add him in a room where Kenny McIntosh, I thought, played the best game of his Georgia career yesterday. Dejon Edwards is a tough, hard runner. I think you have to really like what you saw from your running backs yesterday. And we can touch on, and I wrote a story about it last night, some of the situational football execution that Georgia had, obviously the goal line or short yardage situations. I don't know how much of that is on the running backs. I don't even necessarily know how much of that is on the offensive line. I think a lot of it could be chalked up to play calling and play design, rather. I think Georgia just went very vanilla in those situations, and Kentucky was able to man up physically and make the plays there needed. I think you can look back a week ago where in a goal line situation, they do a play action pass to Brock Bowers, and that worked very well. And so I think Georgia knows, and this maybe played a part in it, that they can get deeper into the schematic bag that Todd Monken has in bigger games. But against Kentucky, you just like to see your team go mano a mano, and it's a credit to Kentucky that they have the team that they do that is able to at least physically stand up to the test that Georgia is able to give them. Let's see, scrolling down. Questions. Randy Payne brings up Hendon Hooker, torn ACL, done for the season. Absolutely hate that for him. I know there were a lot of Georgia fans that don't love the way Tennessee and Tennessee fans conducted themselves this season, but Hendon Hooker, a really special player, a guy that elevated that program. And look, that was an electric atmosphere in Sanford when Tennessee came to visit, and Hendon Hooker deserves a lot of credit for both the way I think he performed in that game, but even getting Tennessee to a point to where that game mattered in the manner in which it did. And while he didn't necessarily, I think, play the game that he wanted to against Georgia that day, that guy took an absolute beating from Georgia and kept getting up time after time after time. And it says a lot about the toughness that player plays with. And I think Hendon Hooker is obviously off to the NFL. We'll see how this knee injury impacts his draft status. But I think he's a guy who, if you're looking for a quarterback at the next level and you don't have a top tier pick of, say, Bryce Young or CJ Stroud, who even CJ Stroud, I have a lot of questions about what he might look like. I know people are going to say Will Levis is a possible, and he will be a top 10 quarterback. I don't know. Based on what I've seen from Hendon Hooker and his time at Tennessee, obviously the system is partially to blame for his success there. I like what Hendon Hooker brings to the table as an NFL level quarterback, and I hate it for him that he suffered the injury in the manner in which he did, because he obviously deserved to go out in a better manner than which he did. Torn ACL, leaving a game that his team lost 38-63. I believe that Tennessee-Vanderbilt game is at Tennessee this weekend. That should be a very special environment for Hooker, and I hope that he is celebrated in the manner in which he deserves. Yeah, John Adams. This is a good point on. We touched a little bit on Javon Bullard. Kamari Lassiter, Kentucky tried a couple times yesterday to try and test him on some screens. Went nowhere. Went actually for negative plays that actually hurt Kentucky there. And I think Kamari and Keely Ringo, and you can include Javon Bullard there as well. They are so physical and such excellent tacklers. I think it really impresses what this Georgia defense has been able to do this year. Obviously, Barium Brown has a big game yesterday for Kentucky, 145 receiving yards, I believe, for there, and he did some really nice things. And it was a guy that Georgia very much wanted in the recruiting trail last year, and ultimately chose to stick with Kentucky. He had a really sensational game there for Kentucky, but I think with overall, you look at the afternoon that Georgia's defense had and the game that Ringo, who had another big time interception in the end zone of Levis there, Kamari Lassiter stepping up and making big plays. You like what you've seen from this corners and this secondary as they've gotten better, in my opinion, each and every week. Tim Mars. So this is a good point in targets. I'm assuming you were talking about, from the pass catching game. Part of it is Kenny's been banged up at various times this year. He's been dealing with a thigh contusion too. I think Georgia knows they have Kenny as a wide receiver, a pass catching option in their back pocket in games, say against an LSU, against a TCU, against a Michigan, Ohio State, Clemson, USC, whoever that college football playoff team is. They know that they can turn to that and go to that, and they don't necessarily need to give Kenny any extra more hits in the pass catching game. And he's been very dynamic in the running game as late there as well. And so I think they know when they need to, they can get Kenny McIntosh the ball in space as a pass catcher, but they want to see him do other things for this offense as well to make it a more diversified offense. You saw that against Oregon and Samford and South Carolina early in the year in terms of what he can do as a pass catcher. And I think, Georgia may be going away from that is trying to establish other parts of its offenses. And again, yesterday, it was tough conditions to throw the football. They called a season low 19 passing attempts. I think the weather absolutely played a factor on that. Let's see. Let's maybe do one or two more questions. Al Clements, do we think we see Carson Beck on Saturday? I know Georgia would probably like to get him in there. I think that all depends on how much Georgia is able to get up and get ahead in that game. If they take care of business like they did, say, against Vanderbilt, I think you could see a similar script where they do give Carson some reps there at the end of the season and try to get him a little bit more season going into next year where obviously Kirby Smart's going to say it's a competition. Obviously, Brock Vandagriff and Gunnar Stockton will factor into who starts at quarterback next season. But I do think that Carson Beck, based off what we've seen both in the spring and then over the course of this season, looks to be the guy who I would handicap as the favorite to be Georgia's starting quarterback next year. And so I do think you want to get him more reps. And again, that comes down to Georgia just taking care of business, gutting out to a fast start, putting this game away early, and allowing Beck a chance to get in there and work some things like they did in the Vanderbilt game. Let's see. We'll do one more question here. Let's see. Yeah, Alex, this is a good point. And we sort of touched on Barry and Brown, the big game that he had. It is concerning, especially you look at the way Georgia lost to Alabama last year. How was it done? Giving up those big chunk plays to Jamison Williams and John Mechie there in the first half of that SEC championship game. I don't think LSU has the athletes to do that on the outside. I don't think Michigan has the passing offense capable of doing that. But I think Ohio State and USC do, and those are going to be teams that Georgia very well likely sees at some point in the college football playoff. Now, USC has a lot of other issues that I think might even get exposed before Georgia gets a chance to play them. But that's a Ohio State team, even without Jackson Smith and Jigba. Marvin Harrison Jr. is a stud. Ameja Abuka is a stud. Julian Fleming is a very, very good football player. They've got the wide receivers and quarterback capable of taking advantage of that. And I think they're even more talented than the Tennessee trio of Jalen Hyatt, Cedric Tillman, and Broom McCoy. And so, how the Georgia secondary holds up in those deep passes was an issue for them last year, and we'll see if it becomes an issue for them this year. Let's see. Let's maybe do one more question. Foster Moss sort of looking at the playoff picture, and we'll use that as our jumping off point here for tonight. Yeah, so Tennessee, done. USC, I think, a clear beneficiary there. And if they win out, if they beat Notre Dame this weekend and win the Pac-12 championship game against either Oregon or Utah, they're likely in. I don't think USC is going to do that. I think they might go ahead and lose this weekend to Notre Dame in those circumstances there. LSU controls its own destiny in terms of they beat Texas A&M, they beat Georgia, they're probably going to get in. Just given, even though they have two losses, the losses to, I think, Tennessee and Florida State are quote-unquote good losses. And again, the SEC champion has not been left out of the college football playoff, and I don't see that changing this year. I think if Georgia wins this weekend, they lock it up. But obviously, we know this team wants to go out on a winning note and win the SEC championship, given that is something that they did not do last year and haven't done since the 2017 season, which for all the success this Georgia program has had is quite a long time ago. So Jacob Eason was still with this program at that point in time. And so I do think that going forward, it'll be interesting to sort of see how things go there. Obviously, TCU, I think they're a team where, yes, the way Tennessee lost on Saturday, I think helps them out quite a bit in terms of even if they don't end up winning the Big 12, which I think they will, they have a little bit more leeway in terms of how things end for them in that manner. I think the loser of Michigan, Ohio State actually has a good chance of potentially making the playoff now, depending on how other things shake out. Though I think obviously if you're the Big Ten, you probably want Michigan to win that game this weekend because Ohio State, I believe, has a stronger case as a one-loss non-champion than a Michigan would there. So playoffs, there's a lot still to still be decided. We didn't think we were going to have a very engaging week this weekend with, Tennessee was a 20-point favorite, Michigan was a 17-point favorite, Ohio State was a 27-point favorite, Georgia was a 20-point favorite. All those teams got close games. Tennessee ends up losing outright. TCU needs a last-second field goal, but that's old hat for TCU at this point. So I think we're going to see a lot of stuff happen in college football this coming weekend, rivalry weekend, big games throughout the sport. Obviously, Michigan, Ohio State at noon on Saturday. You've got USC, Notre Dame to end the evening at 7:30, and then you've got Georgia, Georgia Tech, noon ESPN. This is a Georgia Tech team. They're coming in with something to play for. They're playing for Brent Key really well right now. And this is a Georgia team. If you're them, you get in, you get up big, you take care of business, you make sure this isn't a game like it was in the fourth quarter against Kentucky this past week, and make things easier as you move into the SEC championship phase of your season. So that'll do it for us here tonight. My name is Connor Riley. We're going to have you covered throughout this week. Obviously, Thanksgiving on Thursday is going to impact things a little bit, but you have Brandon Adams throughout the week, Mike Griffith tomorrow night on Monday night. Jeff Santel will have recruiting updates as we get closer and closer to the National Signing Day. And obviously, Georgia, Georgia Tech on Saturday, 12 p.m. in Sanford Stadium. Senior day for the Bulldogs there. Should be an impressive environment for Georgia to send out those seniors on a winning note at home. We'll have you covered throughout the week. Kirby Smart press conference tomorrow and Tuesday, and we'll keep you covered and updated on the website. My name is Connor Riley. This has been a Dog Nation production.